righty, you can go ahead.
My name is Victoria Ballard Currin. I'm talking to Wright Johnson. I was born in, Orange Park, Florida. My dad was in the Air Force. He and my mom were high school sweethearts. And when he got out of school, he decided to go in the Air Force. He was supposed to be a pilot, but my grandmother was afraid for him to become a pilot, so she wouldn't sign the paperwork because he was too young to do it. So he became like a radar technician. And anyway, he and Mom got married. Mom was 19 and he was 21. They were in Charleston, South Carolina, where my sister was born, and then they moved to Orange Park, Florida, and that's where I was born. And my parents, one of their best friends, was in their wedding, and he shows up one day and was knocking on the door, and the lady next door says, "Oh, I think she's having the baby." So he goes over to the hospital, and my name is actually Victoria Lane Ballard Currin because Lane Osley was my dad's best friend who shows up on the day I'm being born, and decided I had to be named for him. So somewhere in there, my dad ends up going to Spain. He's stationed in Spain. So my sister and my mom and I went over in Spain when I was about a year old. We stayed there for 3 or 4 years and then came back to Lillington. So I actually was reared in Lillington, which is where my maternal and paternal grandparents were. And we lived one house over from my mom's mom and dad, and about 6 blocks from my paternal grandparents. So I would say one thing different about growing up in Lillington from today is when I left Lillington at 17 to go to college, there was all of about 1,200 people there. Now you have 1,200 people in a high school. So that's a big change. It was a lot simpler back then. It was a lot quieter. I think it was a lot more family-oriented than we are today, just because people are more spread out. I grew up going to my grandparents' houses. I grew up with having vacations with my uncle and aunt and their 2 boys, and they lived all of, 8 blocks from Mom and Daddy. And like I said, I was one house over from my grandparents. So I would say it was a lot more simple back then, a lot more family-oriented, and maybe a lot more safer. When I was, teenager or yet younger, we used to just play outside and ride bikes, and my best friend lived literally 1 block from the school in one direction, and I lived 1 block from the school in the other direction. So after school, I would just walk to her house, or she would walk to my house. And if I was at her house, the rule was I had to be home 30 minutes before dark. My mama really didn't know where I was, but she knew I was safe, and 30 minutes before dark, I was home. So again, I would say that it's a lot more simple back then, a lot safer. We just played outside and did more things. We didn't sit on computers, and we didn't watch TV, and we definitely didn't have computer games. We were a lot more outside and just maybe had more fun. Then anyway, as I was growing up, the other thing was we would come to Fuquay because my mama's people were from Fuquay. And another change, big difference between now and then was the roads. Oh my gosh, it was, real easy. It's real easy now to get wherever you go pretty much. But back then, everything was dirt roads. And I remember coming from Lillington to Needmore took forever. And now it's, 20 minutes. So that's another big change for me. But growing up, like I said, I lived in Spain for years, and Mama had help over there. And, of course, they were the locals. So when my sister and I finally came back, we spoke more Spanish than we did English, and because that's what we were around all day. So that was a big shock to my grandparents, and eventually my parents had to they forbid us to speak Spanish because we had a tendency to talk to each other and not to anybody else, and nobody knew what we were saying. As far as, I guess the biggest thing I remember The earliest political something I remember would be JFK's assassination. I was about 5, and my sister was she must have been in school. She had to have been first grade. But I was watching it on TV, little black and white, and Mama had help, and of course Miss Francis was with me. And Mama worked as mostly as a bookkeeper and a secretary. I'd say that's another big change too. My mom went to prep school at Campbell, and then she had some college courses, but she was mostly a bookkeeper, secretarial person. Nowadays, women have a lot more opportunities and a lot more avenues to do than back then. And my grandmother did not attend college. My dad did. Of course, my sister and I did. And that was another difference. My sister and I went to college. It was when you get out of college. It was never when you get out of high school. It's when you get out of college, you will get a job, and you are not on the 5-year plan. I remember my dad saying that a lot. But probably JFK was the first political something I remember. And I didn't really understand as a 5-year-old, but I do remember everybody being upset. And so eventually, of course, as I got older, I understood. Like I said, my dad was in the Air Force. He got out, I guess, in 1968. He was in there for a little over 10 years, and he was going to stay, but of course by then he had probably 8 and a 10-year-old, 9-year-old, I don't know. And they were fixing to send him to Vietnam, and he had 6 months left before he had to re-up. And he was like, of course back then, if you went to Nam, you didn't last very long. My dad was supposed to be a gunnery sergeant, and I think they had like a 3-minute lifespan in Vietnam, and because he would have been in a helicopter. And so he talked to little Robert Morgan, Senator Robert Morgan, and got little Robert to intervene, and he stayed at Fort Bragg or Pope Field, and then got out and didn't go back. So that I remember that. That would be one experience I had with military or wars. And then my uncle, my daddy's younger brother, spent 3 tours in Nam. He went back, he upped 3 different times, and I experienced him and the changes of when he came back. He was a much different person than when he went. But one thing I will tell you, this is another change from back then to now. My sister Cindy and I would make brownies or cookies or whatever we made, and Mom would help us pack them, because we're again 10 years old, 12 years old. Mom would help us pack them up in a shirt box, and we would wrap them in like wax paper, and we'd get them all wrapped up and seal them up and send them to Uncle Sam in Vietnam. Of course, it took several weeks to get to Vietnam back then. And he told me one time, he said they would do mail call, and they'd be sitting in a circle kind of around a fire, and they'd do mail call, and they'd pull out this box, and it was crushed. But when they called out Uncle Sam's name, they all knew that it was brownies or cookies or something from home. And he said he would open that box, and it just crumbles. Nothing, you couldn't tell what it was. But he said they would just get all so excited. They would just be grabbing handfuls, eating them, stuffing them down, because they were homemade. Unfortunately, by then, I'm sure they were stale as they could be. But that's another change, is the fact that everything, there was no overnight back then. From now, we order something today and expect it by, lunch tomorrow, and that's a big change. But that was another thing I would say I experienced for the military, was Uncle Sam. And for us, when he came home, he was just Uncle Sam coming home. We didn't understand, my sister and I, we didn't understand all the protests and all that stuff about Vietnam. The only thing we cared about was Uncle Sam was back. So, but then, of course, I grew up and went to school. One other thing I'd say is, when I was in school, I remember there was some discussion I know about what I remember about race relations and different folks. Well, I was the first grade. I was the first year that they integrated I went to sixth grade at the black school in town, in Shawtown. And of course, from 7 up came to Lillington. Became Lillington High, but at the time it was just Shawtown School and Lillington School. And I know we were bused out to Shawtown, which, I didn't really know what to expect, but I didn't have any problems. Some of the kids did, but I have to say, of course, some of the parents were upset, but then some of the black parents were just as upset, and the kids did not want to go to Lillington. They had gone to Shawtown all their lives. They didn't want to come to Lillington, but it's what happened. So, we just did. And the one thing I do remember, which was strange to me, was that a lot of the blacks fought a lot, and they fought each other. It wasn't us. I mean, they just fought a lot. I don't know if was their environment they grew up in, but that was a real change for me. I was not used to that. And as far as gays and things like that, I remember some kids in high school, some girls that were tomboys, what we called them. We didn't call them, well, I didn't know what a gay was. I don't know that I even knew when I went to college what a gay person was. I do know now there were some of my classmates at Meredith that were gay, and I know now of a young man who was gay, who actually died of AIDS, but I had no idea. I just didn't even, that just never hit my radar. And I think that's a big change. We were a lot more innocent back then than we are now. Like I said, I didn't even know what gays were. I didn't know what transgender, I don't even know if that was a term back then. But so I would say that kids, we grew up a lot more simple, and we grew up a lot more protected. We didn't have the 24-hour TV. We didn't have we had 2 stations. I remember my grandparents were some of the first folks in Lillington to get a color TV. That was a big deal. And it was like a piece of furniture. It was huge, big square thing, and it had legs. It was up on legs, and I think it was a Zenith. But that was a big deal. But again, we had 2 channels. We didn't, and ours was black and white. My grandmother and granddad's was color. But that's another big change, I think, in my life, is the 24-hour TV. Of course, the size of TVs, but the 24-hour TV, the 24-hour news. And I don't know that that's such a good thing either, to be honest. You just are bombarded by all this stuff. The TV shows I watched were Andy Griffith and, Bugs Bunny on Saturday mornings. And I remember my sister and I would get up early and watch the horror movies at 6 o'clock. That was a big deal on Saturday morning to watch that. But again, we didn't have, it was cleaner, I think. We didn't have the TV shows that, they didn't cuss at all. And I remember I Love Lucy, they slept in twin beds. When they showed them, they were in twin beds. Now they show really stuff going on. So that's a big change too. And again, I don't know that it's a really good change. I don't think children need to see some of the things they may see. I don't think there's anything wrong with children being innocent for a while and not having adult issues put on them at young age. So that's another change I would say. The other thing I would say is big change for me is telephones. When I was growing up, like I said, I grew up in Lillington. We had telephone, don't get me wrong, but some of them had party lines. You'd pick up the phone and there'd be somebody talking, and you'd realize that, your next door neighbor or third over neighbor or whatever was talking on the phone. So you just hang up, and when they hung up, you'd get this little beep beep thing, and then you'd know they were off the phone and you could use the phone. So that's a big change. And the other thing was, growing up, when I went to call Gran, it was just 5 digits. We didn't have the 91089. Well, 893 is Lillington's, but it was 32010. That's all I had to call to get to my grandmother. I didn't have to do the 910893210, which is, again, a big change. We didn't have all these area codes and all this stuff. So, of course, like I said, when I left in 76, there was all 1,200 people in town, which is a high school now. So, that's another big change, I would say, for me. Probably maybe the best change. I don't know. I had a flip phone forever. Now I have a smartphone, and I still don't know all the stuff it can do. And I sometimes think you spend too much time trying to figure things out. But it is kind of nice now to be able to Google something and just ask the phone to tell me. So I guess that's the biggest change that I have enjoyed the most. I do obviously have a computer, and that's another change. Growing up, I used a typewriter. And if you made a mistake, you had to either, erase it out, or you had this white out stuff you had to use. And so now you can do a computer and just, erase it and spit it out right there on your by your computer. You get a printer. Everybody has a printer in their house. And, I didn't grow up with that. Or even in college, I took computers in college, but we just didn't have all that. And as far as what one of the questions was, what did you remember learning? Well, I'm a chemistry major, so obviously I remember taking a lot of chemistry, all different courses. But my roommate in college was a psychology major. And one of the classes I remember the most, believe it or not, was abnormal psych. She talked me into taking some psychology courses because I had to have electives. She didn't want to take them by herself, so she talked me into taking them with her. And we had to go to 3 field trips. Now, one was Al-Anon. I can't remember one of them, but the other one was we went to Dorothea Dix Mental Hospital and took a tour. And that was very unnerving. There were several of us that went. It wasn't the 2 of us. There was probably, 10 of us that went. But they had a man who walked us through. But going through that mental hospital and seeing some of those patients was very disturbing. It really, really was. There were people sitting on the floor. There were people sitting in chairs. But I remember this one person, this lady that was sitting talking to this empty chair. It was a rocking chair. And the chair was rocking, and when it stopped rocking, she'd reach over and tap it and make it start rocking again. And then she'd be talking to it like there was somebody sitting in it. It was that was some of the things I remember as far as courses I took. But after college, I went to state to get my master's, and I saw an advertisement about CP&L hiring. And so I decided to give them a call. So between classes, I called, and of course I'd use a payphone, which you would never do now. Like I said, that's a big change. But I called, and I went that afternoon and started doing the testing, and went to, I had to take all this battery tests, and then I went to aptitude and whatnot. And then I went to, on Thursday, that was Monday, Thursday, I went to Brunswick to interview. And then in 6 weeks, I started working for CP&L. So I worked for CP&L, I call it my trilogy. I worked for CP&L, Progress Energy, Duke, but it was actually the same company. But we just kept changing names and buying out and getting bought out and whatnot. So that's what I started out in a nuclear power plant as a radiation tech, and then I switched over to a lab tech in the counting room where we counted radioactive samples, again because I have a chemistry degree. And then I left Brunswick and came back to Raleigh. I was what was hired as what was called Harris Complement, which is they were building Harris, and they were going to staff at Harris, but they hired up some of us earliest and put us in the field at other nuclear power plants to get experience. So then we came back up here, and I worked at the E&E Center, which is the environmental center, and did environmental work. And then I actually went to Harris and helped write the procedures and bring the system online and run a lot of the startup testing. And one of the neat things I did there, of course, we were called blue hats because we were CP&L back then. We all wore blue hats. So we were the blue hats, and we could go anywhere we wanted to. We actually crawled through the reactor building. I actually crawled through the piping up into the reactor vessel and then out. So that was kind of neat because there was nothing there at the time, just so you could go wherever you wanted to. But we were learning the plant. So we would take drawings and look at them and go walk plants and crawl through things. And So that was kind of neat. One time I'm standing there, and of course, they're building all around us and pouring concrete. And somebody did something, and this just bucket of concrete just poured over my head. Luckily, I had on my hard hat. That was a lot of fun, too. But, it was a lot of neat things back then. So, anyway, I was at Harris during startup, and then I left Harris and actually became the chemistry instructor for all of nuclear. So I traveled between Robinson, Harris, and Brunswick doing training for the nuclear plants. Eventually got promoted on up, and I was in management at Harris corporate training. And then I went over to fossil generation, the coal side of the house, and I worked training for the gas generators and the coal and the water. And then I eventually retired as the training manager for 2,500 people. I ran the technical training programs, safety programs for all of we called it fossil generation. So that's kind of what I did for a living, and I guess how I got there. So do you have any questions? Did I hit most of your?
That's most of my questions answered. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good luck.
Thank you.